Oh, hi everyone, and welcome to our Golden Resource webinar today. I am very honored to have Dr. Irit Felsen here, a very sought after international speaker. Um, Dr. Felsen is a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma, and has a specialization in the second generation survivors and their experience as second generation survivors. We know that your experience is unlike other experiences. It is unique. It is usually not necessarily validated enough. People don't understand unless they are a second generation survivor or know about it or have really witnessed it. Um, and this is a very special group of people. So I am so honored to have Dr. Felsen tonight. She is an expert in this area and has helped so many people, and I'm just very excited. I'm very excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm very honored to be invited, and I'm so happy to see some faces that I know from my second generation peers. And I will now start sharing my PowerPoint. Let's see. So, yes, just to make sure we're on the right one. Okay. So, welcome everybody. And, these days we have this important habit of mentioning to people that speaking about trauma and everything around trauma can, of course, be potentially triggering. And it's very difficult to speak of the barbaric atrocities that our parents went through and the impact of these cruelties on them and on some of us who are not directly exposed to it without it being potentially triggering for some of us. So we need to be aware of the potential danger of feeling triggered and allow each of us the freedom to take care of yourself in whichever way you need. If you need to leave us, we understand. If you need to leave for a few minutes and come back, we understand. But we also must be aware of the fact that we cannot totally sanitize the story and completely distort it. So we have to talk about things striking some kind of a balance between these two uh, aims or goals. And as I said, please feel free to take care of yourself in whichever way you feel you need to. Um, So I wanted to share with you why is it important for us to talk about the intergenerational transmission of effects to the children of survivors. Like Sarah said, it's not always validated, even these days, after all the empirical, clinical evidence that I will share with you. So this is an email that I received from a very, very senior colleague of mine whom I very much respect in many, many, many ways. But he sent me this following email because he knows that I specialize in treating children of survivors. And he wrote, "Hi, Irit. One provisional question slash comment regarding a possible illusory binary between Jewish offspring of survivors and Jewish offspring not of survivors. Given I was born in 1945 in a close-knit Jewish community with three buddies, sons of survivors, we were all in some ways the surviving generation. I began to feel this way many years ago when I was a guest, quotation marks, at the Children of Survivors meetings with an aura of you cannot possibly know what your world, what our world is like, an assumption that was at odds with my own experience. Of course, I said nothing. I sensed that it was important for the group to feel they were unique, a feeling that may have contributed to a sense of being special. Just a thought, warm regards. So here is someone who's very, very well respected psychoanalyst, psychotherapist in our community of very senior, seasoned therapists who's basically saying to me, do you really think that the second generation is any different than other Jewish children born at the same time in this country? We all kind of shared, we were all the survivor generation. Isn't it the same for me and for my buddies who were children of survivors? And the answer to that, which I definitely feel is very, very true, is by Bukiet, who wrote an anthology of writings by the descendants of survivors. And he put it this way: no one who hasn't grown up in such a household can conceive it, while every second generation has something in common. And that will be what I want to share with you. So let's start by a quick review of what is trauma, the trauma that our parents lived through, which is the trauma we talk about when we talk about intergenerational transmission of effects related to the uh, events that our parents endured. So I like this definition by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, Services Administration, and they said trauma results from an event, a series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced subjectively by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So I call this the three E's. Trauma is something that is defined by the three E's: a particular event in external reality, the subjective experience that the person has, which is different from one person to the other. Even two people who stood there and suffered the same event may have a different subjective experience. And the effects, the lasting effects, which are also very different between people, depending on many, many, many different factors. So we see a great variability in the impact on the survivor population. Everybody is different, and yet we see certain things that are very common. And I will just mention to you that trauma and the concept of post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder, which we now hear so much about in the discussions in every arena, were not at all part of the diagnostic system that we use in mental health professions until 1980. So when our parents came out of that trauma of the Holocaust, discovering that they lost most of their families and their world, there was no PTSD, there was no conceptualization of it. And of course, that interfered greatly with what kind of help was available to the survivors at the end of the war. I will not bore you with the exact definition of post-traumatic stress disorder, but finally, when it came into our DSM, the statistical, nosological system that we use to diagnose conditions and mental health problems, it included three clusters, the exposure to an event, having intrusive phenomena, which is like nightmares and fragments of memories that intrude upon one's awareness unbidden and involuntarily, and avoidance of anything that might trigger such memories, avoidance of places, people, all kinds of things, external and internal, that might create a triggering of those memories. All of that was very appropriate for the definition of people suffering from traumas that were not as extensive as the trauma of the Holocaust. And finally, we understood that as a profession, and the definition has changed to include cluster D, which I highlighted here in red, which means the alterations, negative alterations in the way that people think of themselves, of other people, of what does it mean to be a person in the world amongst other humans, changes in mood that are very long-standing, changes in beliefs about justice, about God, about other people, and all kinds of other long-standing changes to what we would otherwise consider really the personality of the person, not just those symptoms that were included before. And which included also, as you see down there, arousal, the irritability, self-destructive behavior. We didn't see so much self-destructive behavior among survivors, but definitely many survivors reported continuing to suffer from irritability, from startle responses, from hypervigilance, from sleep disturbances, and all kinds of things like that. Those were the symptoms that the parents suffered, very much so after the war, very much so in the early years when they actually established their families and raised their young children. And here I show you just so that you see, this is a graph that summarizes a meta-analysis of 71 studies of Holocaust survivors, many, many years, decades after the end of the war. And it shows you basically that those two pillars in the center, they are pillars of symptoms of post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress syndrome. In that area, especially, survivors continued to have very high symptoms for 60 years after the war, even. In all of the other areas, as you see, the symptoms were not so high. They did not differ from other people in their cognitive functioning, in all kinds of other things that were measured, but the post-traumatic symptoms remained very, very high. And the reason that you see two pillars there is because one pillar represents survivors who were never seen by mental health professionals, never received any kind of mental health intervention, and lived very successfully in the community. And the other is a pillar of those studies that were conducted on, so to speak, clinical samples, which means any setting where the sample was collected, which was maybe a mental health agency or patients who saw a private therapist, it doesn't matter, people who had some kind of contact with mental health professionals. Both those and those who never asked for any help and never got any help continue to have very high levels of PTSD, as I say, throughout the years of raising their newly established families and raising their children, namely us. And that's what I basically say on this slide here. We see similar effects, by the way, very long-term effects of World War II on many, many other populations that were exposed to it, not only Jewish Holocaust survivors, but also other civilian populations, as well as, of course, combat soldiers and Dutch sailors. We see it in many, many populations since then. Now that we have a very clear definition of PTSD and PTS, we measure it in populations that were exposed to trauma much more recently, and we see very, very high levels of symptoms, which only tells us how high the symptoms must have been with our parents if we had had the same scales to assess them with at the time. And to just remind you, post-traumatic stress disorder is not the only reaction to severe trauma, such as the Holocaust. Many people responded with depression and anxiety, or a combination of a depression and anxiety, or all kinds of problems in just in daily living that did not reach clinical levels necessarily, but were still way more than enough to impact how they felt and how they were experienced in their home and in their family. There are different risks for who develops PTSD. People are not the same. And we have many, many things that contribute to our differential vulnerability. Some of them are apparently, as we now learn from genetic research, some of them are genetic. There is a different genetic heritability for the sensitivity to stress reactions. Between 20 and 40% of the risk is the genetic heritability. And of course, personal history, children who suffered negative circumstances before they were exposed to a trauma will have a higher risk to develop PTSD than children who had a very good life history until then. And of course, there is now the whole new field of epigenetics, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And I think I put that right here. Epigenetics is a new field that came to be about 20 years ago, and it shows us that when people are exposed to prolonged and massive trauma, such as the Holocaust, but not only, there are changes that occur not in the structure of our DNA, but in the myelination of the DNA. Namely, the DNA is covered like an electrical cord, it's myelinated, and some segments get peeled, uncovered, which changes the way that the DNA is then expressed. A good way for me, who's not a biologist, to understand it is an analogy that was shared by a friend who said, it's like a piano. The piano has a certain set keyboard, and that doesn't change. That's our DNA. The structure of our DNA doesn't change. But it's as if you took some sellotape and taped down some keys. Now the piano plays a different kind of music. And that's what happens when certain segments of the DNA get peeled off, so to speak, which is one of the hypotheses, by the way, that explains possibly why many, many of us have a tendency for high cholesterol and prediabetes and all kinds of conditions like that. The hypothesis being that our parents' bodies changed, the epigenetics of our parents' bodies changed to make it possible for them to survive starvation. And that was passed on to their children born after the war, so that we will also be able to survive a diet of starvation and survive it well. However, thankfully, we don't live in such horrible conditions. We eat a very much richer diet, and that makes us much more susceptible to prediabetes and high cholesterol and all of those conditions. As a group, we have more of it than our peers who are not children of survivors. Uh, his the studies of our families cover by now most of the life of survivors, and as we are ourselves entering our old age, it covers most of the life of the second generation, how we managed all kinds of challenges, how we navigated life's transitions, whether it was adolescence, young adulthood, marriages, first marriages, second marriages, parenthood, and now our own aging, and also how we respond to all kinds of threatening events, such as getting a diagnosis of an illness or losses that occur in our lives. All of that has been by now researched, and we have a very large body of robust empirical studies, in addition to a very large body of clinical reports. And that led to finally, the acceptance of the concept of intergenerational trauma and even historical trauma. And it guided research about this in many other populations, following what was done in our families. Because there are, as you are aware, many groups in this country and not in this country who suffered massive collective trauma and also show many of the same features of intergenerational transmission as we see in the children of Holocaust survivors. However, many of you might have heard about the ACE studies. Those were studies that were conducted by Kaiser Permanente, the insurance company. They had the health data of a very large sample of people across the country, and they checked it against the reports by these people of um, adverse childhood events. That's what the ACE stands for. And the adverse childhood events included, forms of abuse in childhood, or a parent being incarcerated or divorce, and all kinds of categories like that, 10 categories. The very, very dramatic findings showed that when a child has more than four ACEs, when the child had more than four ACEs, their chances of incredibly higher, their chances are incredibly higher to suffer from a whole array of physical and mental problems in their adulthood. Now, just keep in mind, those of us who are children of child survivors of the Holocaust, child survivors of the Holocaust suffer more than four ACEs a day during the Holocaust. So it is truly a remarkable findings that not more of them were completely dysfunctional, and that they were able to rebuild lives and to participate in society in such a pro-social as they did. Um, the other thing that, of course, is very, very important to add is that when people suffer terrible things such as earthquakes, natural disasters, industrial disasters, they may feel a lot of terrible things happening to them. But there is a big difference between that and what somebody coined the term malignant trauma, trauma that was inflicted on people by people with the intent to harm them. And that is, of course, what the Holocaust was all about. So I will skip that slide and say, basically, I like this quote that says, trauma can serve as a filter or a lens through which a person views the world. Think of sunglasses. You put them on and everything is shaded differently. Trauma can have that type of effect on how a person perceives their world. And that all of that still pertains to our parents. And here we come to the second generation. And this is the cover page of a book, an illustrated novel, very similar in that style to Mouse by Art Spiegelman. This is by Michel Kishka. He is a cartoonist who was born to a survivor family in Belgium and immigrated to Israel. And he wrote this book, Second Generation, The Things I Didn't Tell My Father. And as you can see, basically Kishka illustrated himself standing on a stage, which is his father's Auschwitz cape, prisoner's cape. So the stage of his life is his father's Auschwitz prisoner cape. And my mentor and good friend, Dori Laub, who was a psychiatrist at Yale and a child survivor himself, put it this way. He said, children of survivors view the world from a vantage point of the knowledge of a catastrophe that ravaged the family. So similar to Kishka saying, the stage of my life is my father's survivor status and experiences, we view the world from the vantage point of the knowledge of a catastrophe that ravaged our families. And this knowledge is not an informational knowledge about the historical facts that took place during the Holocaust, not even the details of our parents' own story, which many of us, by the way, have a very hard time creating a coherent story of all the fragments that we ever heard about our parents' story. The knowledge that Dori Laub was talking about is a personal experiential knowledge that we carry inside us that is an experiential knowledge of events we never lived through ourselves, and that experiential knowledge of it is mediated through daily interactions and the relationship with our parents. Let me tell you that I speak about this phenomenon in the term that I coined for it, the dual reality of children of survivors. And what do I mean by that? I mean that we who were born after the end of the war, we who were lucky enough to live so far, our first 70 years after the end of World War II, and between that and 9/11, I refer to as the good 70 years, like in Joseph's life, the 7 good years and the 7 bad years. We lived in the relatively good 70 years in which it seemed like the world is getting somewhat better and that there will not be a third world war and there will not be such atrocities anymore. So, in that reality, relatively safe reality to which we were born in Israel, in Canada, in the States, in Sweden, wherever we were born, I look at that as the reality of our here and now, yes? And I say, imagine that you live in a world with a glass floor. Above the glass floor is that reality, the reality of our life in the here and now, in a relatively safe reality where you learn to behave politely and give other people their turn and not to push and all of those niceties. But under the glass floor is a completely other reality in which that knowledge of the trauma and of what people are capable of, what our parents endured and what people are capable of, lives. And why do I say glass floor? Because I want you to understand that if we were walking on a glass floor, we would be looking ahead, we would be looking at what's around us, but somewhere in the periphery of our visual field, we would always be perceiving on some level the reality of those completely different, inconceivably terrible events that occur in that other reality under the glass floor. And in the same way, we are experiencing in the periphery of our awareness, we know that people, as I say, are capable of those terribly, inconceivably cruel things. And I say are, not were. It's not something that we think people were capable of at a certain time, different time, in a different place. We know that under certain circumstances, people are capable of it. For example, I often think of the Hurricane Sandy. I was living then in New Jersey in a very, very polite and manicured suburb in which people were very, very, well behaved all the time. And after 4 days of Sandy, when there was no gas in the gas stations except for very short periods of time, they needed policemen at the gas station because people began to behave so badly and to have fights with each other. Was it a surprise to a child of survivors? Absolutely not. That's what I call the dual reality, because we live in a reality that has that kind of alternative in it all the time. So I'll show you a picture that to me is very meaningful. If we were in the same room and I would be showing you this picture on the screen, on a big screen, I guarantee you I would hear an audible kind of gasp in the audience because we, children of survivors, see here this. Other people see what it actually is. They see grapevines in the snow. We see inmates in the roll call on the snowy Platz in the concentration camp in the morning. We see in these grapevines that are gnarly and naked like this, we see this. So our emotional response is to something that is from that trauma reality in the back of our minds, in the periphery of our awareness. And it can sometimes be almost a disproportionate, irrational response to something that evokes associations to the Holocaust for children of survivors. It is not only something we see in children of survivors. This is a picture I took down from the internet, but it is to illustrate something that a person that I worked with as a patient told me. He came from Europe after the uh, um, conflict in Bosnia. And he said to me, I was walking in the street in this beautiful little town with my family, having a nice day. And all of a sudden, I saw this laundry, and the pants were moving in the wind, and it completely destroyed his mood. He was completely triggered. He couldn't get back to himself. Nobody in the family understood why. And the reason why it happened was because to him, it evoked the image of people that he saw who were hanged. So the triggers for our parents and the triggers now even for us are often invisible to other people. It is something that evokes a memory for us and not necessarily is seen or understood by other people. My senior colleague, Charles Figley, said that the effects, this intergenerational transmission that I call the dual reality of trauma, the way that it happens to the people in the family who were not exposed to the same trauma is by what he called secondary traumatization. And he said, simply being a member of a family and caring deeply about its members makes us emotionally vulnerable to the catastrophes which impact them. So we, whether it is a spouse or whether it is the children of someone who has a lot of post-traumatic symptoms, we are impacted by the fact that this person has those symptoms because we identify with them, because their functioning as a spouse or as a parent is somewhat impaired by those symptoms. And as we see in many studies, I only quoted one here, but we see it in spouses of American servicemen as well as in Israeli military personnel. About a third of the traumatized, unexposed wives of these people who have PTSD develop symptoms of PTSD themselves. And how does it happen? So here is something called the still face experiment. And I strongly recommend that you watch it. It's very short. So I'm looking at the time, and in the service of time, I will not show it. But I really strongly recommend that you just Google the still face experiment, and you will see how sensitive a 4-month-old baby is to the changes in the affective expression of the mother, and how sensitive they are to those moments in which a mother who had some traumatic experiences, when she, for a moment, for a minute, is in her memories and not responsive to the baby, you will see how dramatically clear it is, how sensitive babies are to it. I will also strongly recommend that you watch a much more recent documentary about the same phenomena. You just Google Beatrice Beebe on YouTube, and you will get to see the work of my colleague, Beatrice Beebe, that shows the same thing, the way that children, infants, are so sensitive to it. And why is that relevant to us? Because we were the children of these parents who, for moments here and there, were away in their memories, were away in their depressive moments. And in addition to those moments when they were just away for a minute, unavailable, uh, thinking about something bad that was triggered, and how quickly infants perceive it, you will see in those documentaries. In addition to that, there was also the moments that people talk about in their childhood memories where a parent was really triggered in a way that they were not able to contain. They weren't just still faced, they actually were very upset in some way. And how disorganizing the impact of such moments was for some of us whose parents had such experiences. This is a movie, not a documentary, called Fugitive Pieces. And I recommend that you try to watch that too. And there is a moment there which you will see where a child who seems to have a very warm relationship with their father is eating an apple. And then he gets bored with the company of the adults and he leaves the half eaten apple and wants to go play. And that totally triggers his concentration camp survivor father, who then yells at him about how can you leave a half-eaten apple? Do you know what that would have been for us in the concentration camp? And you see the fear of the child and the sense of not being able to understand what's going on with that father and what did I do wrong. And those are the type of interactions that a lot of us have experienced. This is a page from Mouse where little Mousy comes crying home and his father asks, "Why are you crying?" And Mousy says, "I was playing with my friends and I fell and I fell down and they didn't wait for me. They ran away." And his father just offhandedly says, "Friends, put them for a week in a room without food and then you'll see what friends are." So those are the types of small daily implicit and explicit experiences that create that dual reality, that sense that there is a reality for the children of survivors. There is a reality that's different from the reality that we live in. Mousy thinks that those are his friends, but somehow now he's recognizing that there must be another reality where they're actually not his friends and where his own perceptions are not exactly the full perception of reality. This is how the dual reality is created. And this is just a beautiful depiction of the dual reality from an art project by Shimon Ati. He projected life-size images from Jewish life on the abandoned buildings in the Jewish ghetto. And it shows you that beautiful, complex thing that we're talking here about, of something, the ephemeral, if you like. It's there and not there. It is there, but not quite as it was in the memory and in the experience of the second generation. So, what is the most important finding from the second generation? The most important finding is that there is no higher rates of psychopathological conditions in the second generation, but there are a lot of elevated levels, still within the normative range. It's not clinical, but we have more guilt feelings, more anxiety, more hypervigilance, more mistrustfulness than other people who are not children of survivors. We also have higher, actually, socioeconomic achievements than our peers born to American-born parents. Many of the psychological themes that characterize us, no matter where we were born, include some of the following: survival themes in the atmosphere of life in the family. So it's somehow something that floats around: life and death, survival, special attitudes about food, failed intersubjectivity, which is a concept that was coined by my friend Hadass Weissman in Haifa, and it pertains to those moments, just like that child in the movie who doesn't understand why his father is responding in such a crazy way to the fact that he just wants to go and play and he didn't want to finish the apple. So it's a accumulation of experiences of not really understanding the survivor parent and also feeling not fully understood by the survivor parents because of many reports by second generation who felt that when they were growing up, the parents were very invested in their well-being and in making sure that they have everything that they need, but the parents were also not emotionally available to really perceive the child as the person that the child was and really interact with the child in that way. The understanding that the parent is so overburdened with what they suffered and with their hard work and with their sleepless, nightmarish nighttime experiences, children understood that they have to put their parents' needs ahead of one's own needs. And that is a very powerful finding with the second generation, being constantly sort of paying attention to how the other person, how the parent is feeling, not to trigger them, not to cause them anxiety, not to create that kind of an upheaval with them, which also interfered greatly when we were young with our sense of freedom to be our own person, to follow our own wishes and needs, and our sense of autonomy. There are many, many more things that one can say about that, but as I'm looking at the time, I'm going to skip over. And one of the aspects of that sensitivity to the parents is also related to what we call role reversal. A lot of children described that feeling of having to take care of their parents in many ways. Some of them had to translate language for them, write checks for them, and take on all kinds of real adult roles from an early age. Others just felt the need to take care of the parent emotionally and make sure that the parent is okay. And that is both something that was communicated by the parent or perceived by the child. But this is a very powerful finding in many families of survivors. This is art by Linda Friedman Schmidt that depicts some of these themes. You see on the right the child who tries to be a perfect child, almost like a doll for her father in order to make him happy and not cause any more anxiety. And on the left, you see the older person who feels that their life as a young adult woman is constrained by the need to by how attached and constrained they are in the relationship with their survivor mother. On the other hand, this is a much softer depiction of the interconnectedness between the generations because one of the most significant findings was that we have a very unique relationship with our parents throughout our lives. Yes, it caused some difficulties in our capacity to separate and individuate as young adults. It also, for some people, had many other difficult implications throughout their adult lives, but it also means that extra care and empathy and understanding and connection with the parent and that intergenerational interdependence in its very positive and in its very empathic way. Despite the fact that findings about the second generation are complex and there are some mixed findings, there are two things that are very, very powerfully evidenced in empirical studies, and that is we definitely have a greater sensitivity to stressful events in our lives. We respond more catastrophically to things going badly in our lives than other people. We function very well. So if we get a diagnosis of an illness, God forbid, if there is a divorce, if there is anything of that kind, we function very well. We do everything we need to do, but our internal emotional response is more catastrophic than other people going through the same types of challenges. We also have a particular sensitivity to things that are reminding us of the Holocaust. So we have, to begin with, a hostile worldview, as my colleagues from Israel, Shrira and Shmotkin, called it. We have, in the dual reality that I described to you, we have an image that is always there of catastrophic things that can happen. We expect that bad things can happen. When bad things happen, we expect them to get even worse. We have a certain tendency to catastrophic expectations. And when things happen that reminds us of the Holocaust, that kind of a sensitivity comes very much to the fore in two ways. I've seen it in my own research during COVID. We, on one hand, respond much more catastrophically. We see the danger. People said to me, I was like a canary in the mine. I could tell that it was much more serious when other people still thought it was nothing. I knew that I need to do certain things when other people were still poo-pooing it. So on one hand, a more catastrophic expectation, but it's also at times very adaptive, of course, like a canary in the mine. And also it is a sense of it is associated with a lot of resilience, a lot of comparisons to what our parents went through, and a sense that this is small relative to that. And if they could go through this, we can go through this much more easily than other people who are not children of survivors, who felt that it was much more difficult for them. But we have such a different frame of reference. We compare it to something so much worse than other people. Finally, I want to talk about October 7th and our responses to October 7th. You know, this is a study that we conducted in North America, myself and my colleagues, Amit Shrira and Yoav Bergman. And what you can see here, I'll be very quick. I'll just get to the sort of main point. What you can see here, we asked people about their level of psychological distress, at least the way they report it, yes, before October 7th and since October 7th. And what you can see is that the levels of distress got much, much higher, both for children of survivors and those who are not children of survivors. That's very understandable. Levels of distress went up in all North American Jewish people, but much more so in the children of Holocaust survivors. And in the children of Holocaust survivors, we had much more symptoms that had to do with sensory and physiological symptoms and sensations. So people described much more headaches, stomach aches, physiological reactions, difficulties sleeping, all kinds of physiological sensory reactions of stress, more so than other Jewish people who are also upset and also showed psychological distress. And what's very, very important is that in both cases, what people described as most upsetting, because many of them were here in North America and of course connected to Israel, having friends and relatives, but not directly impacted. What was so upsetting to people here was not so much what happened on October 7th alone, but what has happened since then. in terms of the rise in anti-Semitism and the personal exposure of North American children of survivors to this changed atmosphere, this changed world, which in many ways reminds many of us of other times in Europe before World War II. What I want to highlight is that in all of the studies that show how children of survivors differ from other Jewish subjects or Jewish participants, what we see is the most important factor is to which degree the parents continued to suffer from persistent post-traumatic symptoms, including anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And that is whether in some studies the parents were still assessed directly by the researchers, and in other studies, such as in mine and in many others, the children were asked how they perceived their parents and had to rate them on post-traumatic stress disorder scales. When parents suffer from post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder, that is the most decisive factor in how much transmission of effects occurs with their children. And through their children, we see now to the third generation as well. Um, yeah, so the last point that I wanted to make was that these days, a lot of us have experienced what Miri Halpern Barr from Harvard calls traumatic invalidation. Many of us felt that they lost friendships, they lost the feeling of belonging to various professional circles and groups and places we used to feel part of because of the very anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish attitudes that these places or organizations have expressed. And this is a very powerful part of the reaction, the psychological distress that the second generation is sharing with us in the studies and in our second generation group. I told Sarah that I will try to remember to mention to you that my friend Dr. Jenny Frumer and I run a free monthly drop-in Zoom group for second generation. And it has been a very, very wonderful forum. And many people in this forum express how important it has become to them to be able to speak with other second generation about these things, because as I started by in the very beginning, as Buki had said, no one who has not grown up in a household of survivors can understand quite our reaction. And every one of us who did, no matter how many differences there are between us, does have something in common. So I will stop here and thank you very much for listening so intently to so much at once. Thank you very much, and um, we'll open it for a discussion. Thank you. I stop.